Hey, thank you guys for actually coming out early in the morning where we are, and for the people online, thank you for tuning in. So today I'm gonna do a little cooking show demo kind of thing, where it's like, hey, here's the chicken. Sorry. Here's the chicken, and then here's all the steps to make the chicken, right? So, but one thing I wanna kind of stress about the way that I try to work is, you know, the images I chose here for this little splash are just, you know, there's monsters and then there's cartoons and there's monsters and there's cartoons. And I'm never happy, right? When I'm working on a monster, I want to be working on a cartoon. When I'm working on a cartoon, I want to be working on a monster. When I'm getting to work on something that's monstrous and cartoony, all of a sudden I want to do something hard surface or make a lady, right? So that's basically, it's just that part of me that's never satisfied. So what I want to show you today is a character we've been developing in my online class at UArtsy, which is this kind of weird little cartoony warrior guy. And we've been bouncing back and forth between ZBrush and Maya, and I want to show you the ways that we've used ZBrush to try to develop the character, you know, to this point. And the goal is not necessarily to create only a production mesh. We do that in class also. But one of the larger goals is to create a sellable maquette. So you could actually take the maquette to creative direction and say, hey, this is what we think the character is going to look like, with some degree of visual finesse associated with it. So there's obviously caveats, things like, you know, the cloth isn't going to be exactly like this, but the notion of having, you know, kind of this shawl and you know, the leather might be treated by someone in a real pipeline, you know, later on with a greater level of finesse. The face paint, you know, but just to try to get a buy-off on the general look and feel of the character in a pose, you know. It's really difficult to get a buy-off on a character when the character's just completely dead. And sometimes to go from something that is completely dead, neutral, and then actually pose it up or put a rig in it, you know, to pose it up, it can be a little time consuming. And what I like about ZBrush is just in a few hours you can actually get to something with a little more finesse. So I'm going to show you some of the milestones that I use to try to look at this guy. I'm just going to time myself and just say, you know, I'll sculpt for 10 minutes and then I'll move on to the cooking show version where it's like, here's what it looks like after you put all the paprika on it or whatever. So now, the way that I started this character, and one of the ways that I like to start characters, if I'm working from strong concept, you know, either that I generate or I get from someone else, I try to not necessarily start this way, because things like proportions are already figured out for you. But if I'm really just starting pie in the sky, I like to start this way because it gets me thinking about what I think the right things are right away. So we'll just start with this polysphere, and you'll notice it's in Lightbox, it's this one. It's the polysphere here, and it reduces all the way back to a cube. So for me, if you hit reconstruct subdiv a couple of times, you can actually get it to reduce. And I'm gonna duplicate this a few times and just hide the duplicates. And the first thing that I wanna do is go ahead and just get the silhouette of a head, right? And at this stage, I'm not necessarily putting pressure on myself to design anything per se. I really want to react at this stage to whatever I see. So I'll take the next sphere and pull it down. Paul's going to yell at me for using the old style navigation. Never. All right, so now I'll pull this sphere down and I'll start to make a rib cage, right? And really, it's not really technically going to be a rib cage. It's going to be kind of this weird rib cage shoulder girdle combo. But what it'll allow me to do really quickly is to establish an attitude for my character. I'll go ahead and do one more as a pelvis. And this is all pretty easy to set up, right? Just the move tool. And now the very first thing that I want to start thinking about with this character, because again, at this stage, I'm just looking for gesture, right? So with no connective tissue between these, I can start to say, well, if I take the head, pull it way forward, and then take the hips, kind of pull them forward a bit. Now I've got this kind of old man feel, right? Where he's kind of like hunched over. If I take the hips and push them back and take the head and push it back, now we'll get something that hopefully feels a little more heroic. You know, so now we can take this, and you know, now we've got someone who's a hero, right? So let's start with that, and I'll take this last sphere, and I will just make a little neck column. And the other thing that I try to think about at this stage is just the general silhouette and cross-section, right? So in just a couple of minutes, I can kind of set this up, and I like that it gives me complete freedom. And you know, I used to do things like start from a base mesh or start from Z-spheres, and then I took a class with the sculptor Steve Wang, and I saw the way that he treated an armature, and really he was designing the shape, and everything that I'd sculpted physically before that was based on receiving a design. And because he was designing a shape, he did this technique where he just added a bunch of little clay balls to a very simple armature in a T-pose, and then kind of posed the armature. And I was like, man, how could I do a digital version of that? Because that seems really freeing when I want to design a character. So, you know, this was my attempt at trying to replicate a similar workflow, you know? So it's under 5 minutes, and we've already started to establish, some very basic kind of proportions. So I'll go ahead and put a little belly connective tissue in here. And the other thing that this does for me is it gets me thinking in the round right away. And what I mean is a lot of characters really suffer from having kind of planaritis, right? The front is the front and the side is the side and the back is the back. And when you look at them lit, you really see that it's almost like, you know, they're only built orthogonally. And by working with these rounded shapes, if I really pay attention this early and I say, well, he's going to be really broad-chested, I can kind of drop this back, then that sets me up for success when I go in to drop in the clavicle and to pick where the pit of the ribs are and things like that. So I'll just merge these guys really quickly. All right. And then I'll just dynamesh them together. All right, and when I dynamesh at a really low resolution. So here I just set mine to 64. And you can even go in at this stage and even Z-remesh it if you want. I won't do that right now. Let's turn off our polyframe. The other thing that I like to do is ZBrush for me is not really a sculpting program. Sculpting is tactile, like you can really touch it or whatever. ZBrush is an awesome drawing program for me that lets me draw in 3D. And other people might feel, other people might feel different. But for me, what I like to do is I don't try to put pressure on myself to make the right mark first. I try to just make a mark and accept that it's probably going to be flawed, but trust my judgment to judge that mark and then make the adjustment. So, you know, I can kind of go in here and start to make these marks. So let's say we go and add in the clavicle, and I'll make this a little bit darker so it's easier to see. Let's say we want to start adding in the clavicle, and we want to get that kind of bicycle handle shape, that little S-curve shape. So I made that mark, and then I can go in and look at my geometry, and I see like either the mark is wrong or the mass is wrong. So let's treat it like the mass is wrong, and now I can kind of course correct, and I haven't gone down the path of that thing being wrong for a while, right? So it's like a way to just quickly error check, you know, when I'm first blocking out a shape. And let's see. Just kind of block this out a little bit, and then I will. So like most of the presenters that I noticed this weekend, I noticed some real similarities between a lot of folks. a lot of people tend to take advantage of the fact that ZBrush is so customizable. So you'll see my interface is not the standard interface. At the end during Q&A, if anyone wants to download mine, let me know. I'll tell you where you can get it. But also the general brushes that a lot of people tend to block characters out with seem to be the same. A lot of people gravitate towards the same few brushes. But when you look at the variety of work that's out there, it's one of the indicators that, you know, while ZBrush is a fantastic tool, it's enabling the artist to bring their sensibility, you know, kind of to the foreground. Because if it was the program doing it with everyone using the same brushes, and you hear this a lot from people who don't understand the notion of concepting on the computer in 2D and 3D, they say, well, the computer's doing the work for you. And it's really not, because if it was, we'd have a lot more similar characters, right?
That actually can go into a good question come from the Twitter feed, Danny.
Yes, sir.
If you're ready. And those might not know what it is, but someone's asking, DJ's asking, what inspired Lunch Crunch?
I went to go work at a game studio in Seattle, and I was terrified, and I had never worked at a game studio before. I was a modeler for a lot of years at a film company back east at Blue Sky. And I decided I wanted to try to do other things. I thought video games were cool. I didn't know if I could really do it. I went there, I was very honest with them and said, look, I've never painted a texture. I don't know what to do. You know, I don't know how films work. But they had a position open for a prototype game, and I looked around and saw people there. Everyone was working in different ways. And Lunch Crunch was really my subversive way to say, hey, how are you doing that? And there were a few other guys who had the same questions there for each other. And, you know, we all just decided to start doing these internal lunch crunches, and then where we'd work during lunch. And I didn't want the company to own what we did, so I just made a blog. And we started doing it through the blog, and then that was the beginning of Lunch Crunch. And now Lunch Crunch is mostly on Facebook, although we are looking to, you know, move Lunch Crunch off of Facebook because of the way Facebook, it has limited moderation capabilities. Lunch Crunch is really supposed to be a WIP blog, so work in progress primarily. But anyway, I'll get back to this. So here I'm using Damien Standard, and I like to use this technique as well. So just to delineate shapes, right? I'm going in and I'm picking up a shape, holding down Alt with Damien Standard, and then pushing in a shape, right? And what that's gonna allow me to do is set up a plane, right? And I can kind of look at that plane from above and below and see if it's turning the way that I want. So starting with that rounded shape really set me up to have something that doesn't have that boxy shape. So I can go ahead and clay polish that. So I'll just do a couple of rounds of clay polish, and it gives me something a little bit nicer. I can also take advantage of what ZRemesher does, right? So Dynamesh just basically gives you, at whatever resolution you establish, from the front and back, the sides, and the top and bottom, it kind of collides this grid with your model and then gives you geometry based on that. ZRemesher will actually go through and evaluate the curvature in your model. So before we move on to the next step, I just want to show this one thing. With ZRemesher, if I take this mesh and just ZRemesh it with the default options, it's going to give me, you know, hopefully some edge loops that follow the shape of my model, right? Now, if there's shapes that get lost or muddied, right, then what I want to do, you can use ZRemesher guides. You can use the coloring method, or you make some things red to make them more dense with ZRemesher. So you can play with the settings, like slide the adaptive around. But one of the things that I like to do is I'll take a copy of my sculpt, and I'll actually go in here, and I'll just sculpt on top of it, because what ZRemesher is made to do is look at the curvature of your model and then make evaluations based on that. So it's looking for the deltas or the high points and low points in these models. And now, if I do something like this, it looks pretty terrible, but I'm actually tracing out where I want my edge loops to go. And if I Z-remesh this, we'll see we should get something that follows that curvature through the clavicle a lot nicer. So sometimes I duplicate the model and then just give it something like this. And if we look at the topology, it gave me topology that followed my shape pretty well. So I'll do a block out like this, and then to add, so then I'll smooth back this stuff, and I have something relatively clean and planar. And then from here, I'll start to play with proportion, and sorry for the feedback. So from here, I'll start to play with proportion and rhythm, and I'll do things like if I go to the profile here, and perspective is always a hot topic. Some people are always like, oh, you have to work with perspective on, or you have to work with it off. Because most of my work doesn't end in Maya. Maya is kind of the beginning of my process. ZBrush is the beginning of my process, and it ends in Maya. What I essentially want to do is save my lensing to look at it in Maya sometimes. So I'll export sometimes. And at this stage, in this orthographic view, what I want to do is look at the curvature of the head, see how that relates to the curvature of the sternum, and then later on when I lay in legs, see how that reacts to the curvature of the thigh and to the back of the calf, right? So I can get a rhythm through the whole character and profile. And then I want to go through and do the same thing again from the front, right? So I'm not really thinking that much about the arms at this point, because arms are going to be reactionary. If I have a character that's really hunched over, the shoulder girdle is going to slide forward and the arms are going to come forward like that. If I have a character that's really kind of proud and the chest is poked out, then the shoulder girdle is going to slide back and the scapula are going to slide back and touch, and the character is going to be that. So the arms are going to react to whatever's going on through the middle of the body. So this is where I usually spend most of my time to try to think about how the character is going to be set up. And I'll just kind of dab around with the move tool to establish a good rhythm, hopefully. When I am ready to add arms and legs, starting to look like a Ninja Turtle. When I am ready to add arms and legs, I usually use the curve tube. So this guy only has a single resolution and he's pretty low res. So if I go over to the curve tube brush, I can go ahead and start to add an arm. Maybe that's a little thicker than I want to start. So just change the brush size and click there. And now I can click on the model to get rid of that little line there. And while the rest of the model is masked out, I'll go ahead and do that. And then just start to pull out here. I'll use the move topological instead of move. So all of my commonly used brushes are all, right here on the right. I'm right-handed. I'm using a Cintiq at home and at work and now here. So for me, I put everything here and here on the bottom. The further to the left I go here on the bottom, these are things that I click every once in a while. These are things I click a little more frequently. So the frequency of it, so I'm not always reaching across. Ergonomically, that's probably better for me, I don't know. But then also, I'm never covering the model. So because I'm right-handed, I don't put anything on the left and I don't put anything at the top. Because if I do, because I'm on a Cintiq, this motion is always gonna make me cover up the model. So I just try to have the model always visible, and that's why I move the tools out like this. And for a long time, people would always complain about the ZBrush interface. Oh, why is it not like every other program out there? And I would say, why would you go buy the exact same shirt twice? It just didn't make sense to me. So the fact that you can customize it is really great to me. For me, whatever program I'm using, if it has the ability to customize it and make it faster, I'd rather use my version of what I think the program is going to be used for than maybe what comes out of the box. Whoever designed the initial UI maybe didn't have the same things in mind that I have in mind. So the arms, they're their own polygroup, so we can kind of isolate them and move them around. And really, I hide the arms at this stage. And I'll take them and just duplicate them. So just duplicate the subtool. And then come down here, right? So I duplicated the torso as well. I'm going to go ahead and say split masked. And then I'm going to delete this duplicate of the torso. And I'm going to take this duplicate of the arms and just move them down to make legs. And something I learned from Mr. Ryan Kingsland a long time ago is to basically, as much as you can, with the rotation component of transpose, if you can treat it more or less like a lever, so you can kind of align the view and then just set yourself up with a lever, it just becomes a lot easier to work with. And then now just try to find an attitude through the legs. And without even adding volume or anything to the legs, I can start to look and see what this is, this curve, and just say, okay, well, if the knee's there, I'll start to curve the leg back. Because again, when I turn it, I want to have that feeling that these things arc around, right? So maybe the hips here, don't need to be that wide, and the ankles don't need to be that turned in. So I could play with that for a while, but essentially what that's going to get me is to here. Any questions while it's loading?
That's the fastest sculpt I've ever seen.
Shut up. Shut up.
Magic part of the show.
No, so this is basically more or less where it'll get me, right? Where I've got things kind of blocked out, that probably will take, anywhere from a half an hour to an hour to just get the mask blocked out. And I often switch over to flat color with a darker color sometimes. Oh, he's already got his color locked in, so I'll just leave that. But basically, just to kind of see what I'm getting shape-wise. And then the very first thing that I want to do, let's go over here and get our select lasso.
So there's a Twitter question, if you want to take this one,
Sure.
Danny, from Climb Smith. So you were showing that you started with spheres, but he was asking, do you find it best to always start your character models using Z spheres, or just from the simple sphere, or actually importing base message?
It just depends on what I'm doing. If I'm straight up modeling, like if I'm getting a concept and I'm modeling something for a client, then I will probably not start the way that I just started. The way that I just started is really for me to find proportions that are unique to a project, right? So it's a little more work up front to work that way, admittedly, but I like that it gets me thinking in a way that, if I start with a base mesh, for example, for a character like this, I wouldn't necessarily end up with the proportions that I ended up with. And I wouldn't necessarily end up with some of the rhythms that I end up with, because I'm sort of constrained by that. And same thing with Dynamesh and working piece by piece. If I do that, sometimes I'm not really considering the whole thing. With this, it lets me kind of block out each piece to a really rough state and still consider the whole thing. So even though it's a little more work up front, I really like it when I'm designing a character. So it really just depends on what task I'm trying to accomplish, So now you can see here the stuff that I was talking about with the clavicle. If I want to separate out the column of the neck, say from the trapezius, I can start to establish that stuff really quickly and still see the general silhouette. Something I've been relying less and less these days on that drawing method, and what I've been doing more and more is just using, so here I want to have this bicep dive under the deltoid. And what I'm doing is actually carve in with clay buildup first and then make that little border. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to really have what we have in nature, right? Where when I'm carving in a shape, it's really a big shape and then something pushing in. And really the way most of our bodies work is when you see a crevice, it's because you have a convex shape meeting another convex shape. So this kind of forces that. So here in the forearm as well, I can kind of go and do that, and then do that. So that's another kind of key thing. That's something I wasn't doing as much even just a few months ago. I'm always looking to try to learn, new stuff. And as you learn new things about, the body or body mechanics or things like that, you're always going to want to incorporate that into what you're doing. And that's another reason why I would say be leery of, if you're someone that's using a lot of like, hey, I made a cool insert multi-mesh for a hand. Well, later on, if you learn something about a hand, don't shy away from using something like insert multi-mesh. Just update that hand, right? Otherwise, it's going to reflect the level of knowledge you had when you embarked on that, and you may progress. So that's always something you want to be conscious of. In my UI here, this little backface masking is really helpful when you're, and also if you download anyone's custom UI, like I know Dom's UI is online, and I know a lot of people have them online. My buddy Shane Olson has a really good one. If you look at this stuff, you can hold control on anything, and it gives you at the bottom that little button path, right? So you can always get back to, where the initial thing is. So a lot of times I move this stuff in here because I just don't, I don't want to hunt through menus, so that's 90% of my UI. All right, so just block out this stuff. All right, and now I'm at the stage where I do want to add a little bit of Damien Standard, where I want a plane change, because now I'm going to take advantage again of that where are you? Clay polish. All right, so now let's go ahead and say clay polish, and I have something that blocks out the shapes relatively well. And then I can continue working on that. Clay polish puts a little mask on things, so you have to clear the mask. Make sure you're not doing it double when you dynamesh, or else you're going to end up with a re-dynameshed thing. And then the first thing I did when I popped this open was just have the ability to hide the arms. And again, now I'm looking at that relationship. So I can kind of go here to here. That seems okay. And then what I really want is to look here and see if that hooks up to there. That's kind of okay. And when I turn it, I just want to have that sense that the shapes all belong together. So even though I'm playing with proportion, I'm still trying to plagiarize what nature gives me, because, plagiarizing nature makes sure that mechanically things are going to work. So, for example, I'm playing with the arms and maybe the width of the forearm, but the length of the arm and the way that the elbow is broken up, I try to keep the same. We're made to fold up like this, right? So half, half. Right? And then I try to keep little things like that in mind. Like, all right, so if you want to measure a hand, you have half, half, and then here, if you take your thumb and pinky like that for most of us, it's about the same distance. So if you want to measure the hand, that's that, right? If you just pop the other fingers out. So you can measure your hands against that. This is also the length of your foot, so you can measure the foot against that. So you can play with these conventions from kind of a known place, and I love ZBrush for that, because even this, would take me longer in something like Maya, and that Maya is a tool I've been using a lot longer. It would take me way longer to get to this level of blockout, and if I'm working with someone who can see things relatively rough, then it's a good time to have a discussion about proportions before I start going down a whole other road, right? So after sculpting on this a while, let's go back here, so maybe an hour or two, this is kind of where I ended up with the general proportion and sculpt of this guy. And if we look at him, he's been Z-remeshed. All right, so I have a topology that, is a great sculptable topology. For final topology, if you're working in a place that is really particular about how the deformations and rigging needs to work, it may not give you exactly what you want, but there's certainly going to be pieces that you can use that you don't have to manually retopologize. And then also, it just gives you a good sculptable topology, which I really, really love, right? I use the extract function. So let's go ahead and get our mask lasso, and let's start putting on our first piece of armor. Whoa, mister. A little risque.
I got another question here from the Twitter feed. DJ's asking, it's obvious you know your anatomy. Could you talk about its relevance even for a stylized character to help push the believability?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, so you have to know the right amount. This is going to be a totally weird analogy, but my family can attest to the last few months I've been obsessed with the show Chopped. Have you guys ever seen that show? And basically, what I love about that show is sometimes you'll get a cook on there, and they get these weird things in this basket, and they have to cook them. And they get something, and they go, oh my God, this is really acidic. It needs blah, blah, blah to balance it. Having that knowledge of you don't know what that thing is, and you've never tasted it, but you know what the quality of it is, and then you know what the balance is to counter that, to make something positive. That's how you should, for me, that's how I think about ZBrush or anatomy or any of that stuff. I'm not trying to get the finished cake. A lot of people want the finished cake. I want the recipe to make the cake. And then I know, oh, I added a little too much cinnamon. I got to counter it with this. So with anatomy, I try to think about it like, how am I going to push off of reality? Because a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, it's not realistic. Right? I totally admire people who are doing that kind of work, really fantastic. But when you look at creatures or cartoon characters, what makes them believable is how well they're grounded, right? And that's kind of the way I try to think about this stuff. So I'm going to try to extract this armor piece. Another cool thing about ZBrush, the undos are locked to the subtools. I love that. It took a little while to get used to it, but I can go back and do stuff on this tool only, and it doesn't affect 90 other steps that I've made on another tool. I love that. So now, it's a very unique feature. I don't know of another program that has anything like that, and I like it a lot. So let's try and extract here, way faster, accept. Now go down to this tool, and actually, before I Z-remesh it, I'll just go ahead, because you get that little mask around it. I'll go ahead and smooth it, and that's going to bring it closer to the original silhouette that I masked off, so we won't get so much crashing in the arms and things like that. And then I'm going to Z-remesh that, and we can probably go down in res. So I'll go down to 1,000 and Z-remesh it, and if we look at it, we get that. And I'll Z-remesh it a couple of times, and we'll actually see that it'll relax, and that's the beginning of, kind of the armor piece that I want to use, right? And I can go through and make several armor pieces like that. Now, for our class, what we did was we went through and made armor pieces, or for my character, I made armor pieces like that. And eventually, we retopologized. Now, everybody in here is familiar with the process of retopologizing, yes? Oh,
yes,
yeah,
I am.
Yeah, so, yeah, it's just the most boring thing in the world, right? That and UVs, right? So this is what a retopologized version of a further iteration of that character looks like, right? So this is all the kind of individual pieces retopologized. And if you notice, I have two sections here, one called rigged and one called not rigged, right? And in fact, I'm actually going to take the skin, and I'm going to break the skin out into its own piece as well. So I'm going to say split, split hidden, right? So now I've got the skin, the rigged pieces, and the not rigged pieces. And I'll rename this really quickly. Let's call this rigged. All right, and let's call this skin. I know sometimes I'm going to use Transpose Master. Sometimes it doesn't like when you have numbers in the names. So I'm going to go ahead and take this skin, and what I'm going to do is, let's turn off not rigged, and up here in Z plugin, Transpose Master, I'm going to turn on layer and Z-sphere rig, right? And I've been using this more and more to pose my characters. You know, so I'll show you kind of the mechanics of this. It takes a little while to do the real spin of like trial, error, trial, error, trial, error. So I'll show you kind of the basics of it and then kind of show you what the posed one looks like, right? So I'm going to go ahead with those two things turned on. I'm going to say T-pose mesh, and it's going to take a second, and it's going to give me a transposed mesh, meaning that this mesh is all combined into one piece, even though it's different subtools. So it drops every subtool down to its lowest subdivision level and then combines them into one tool. So I'm going to go ahead and hit X on the keyboard to turn on my symmetry. And I'm going to take this guy, scale him right into the body here. And we're going to be able to use these spheres to rig this character pretty quickly and pretty efficiently. So I'm going to draw out a Z-sphere, and let's make the brush smaller. And I'm just going to move it all the way up to the head there. And then I'm going to hit Q, and that's going to allow me to draw new Z-spheres in here. W to move, Q to draw, E to scale. So I'll just put one big Z-sphere in here. And then Q again, and I'll just draw off a little shoulder. And then for me, I always like to kind of draw the start and end of the chain instead of drawing each segment, because that gives me a pretty good like kind of straight line through that way instead of having to deal with each segment. And then if I need to go into a segment, you know, I can just hit Q and add more segments, right? So I'll just put something in there roughly for the elbow, and then I'll just put one thing in here for both legs for right now. And I just want to see what this is going to give me, right? So I'm going to go down here in the palette, the tool palette, to rigging, and I'm going to say bind mesh. And what that's going to do is now when I bend the arms, so let's go to rotate. I can go ahead and bend up the arms, and it allows me to create the rig, right? Now you can see I'm getting weird pops over here, right? It's a proximity and volume-based system. So now what I can do is, let's go ahead, and I'm going to turn off bind mesh. And I'm just going to, now this is going to look strange anatomically, but I'm just going to go ahead and go into these Z-spheres, and I'm going to either try to scale this out a bit. So now it's closer to those points, and hopefully it takes up those points as part of their weight. If not, I'll actually draw another little Z-sphere off of here that just follows that Z-sphere. So let's just see what we get. Bind mesh. Let's try and rotate the arms again. And now those points don't move as much, but we can see the points up here move a bit. So that's the trial and error part, right, where you got to go in and kind of try a few different, you know, positions and scales for your Z-spheres. But the beautiful part of this that I really, really love is at the end, down here, right, if you say delete mesh, I can take this, if this is a Z-sphere that really works for a mesh with those volumes, I can save this as a Z-tool completely separately, right? And I can do something pretty cool. So I'm going to go back over here, right? So this is the T-pose mesh that I got when I ran Transpose Master. And I'm going to use this Z-sphere on that. So actually, in fact, let's go ahead and delete that. And let's go back to, where are we? Nope. All right, so let's go back to our original. We've got our skin, our rigged, and our not rigged. And I'm going to T-pose mesh that again. And I have those options set up, right? So now what I'm going to do is up here in Z plugin Transpose Master, right? I have a couple of more options. I'm just going to tear that off, put it up here. So now I can go back to this original rig, right? I can say store transpose master rig, and then go back to here, and then say paste transpose master rig. Oh, sorry, wrong tool. The one with the big Z-sphere in it is the one that I want, that one. So I can say paste transpose master rig, and it's going to paste that rig back in. So if you have characters that are similar volumes, similar limb lengths, or whatever, you can kind of set up one rig and then use that as a starting point for all of your other characters. So that leads us to our posed character. So many tools. So this is what, our posed low-res character kind of looks like, right? And really quickly, the ability to show this stuff as more than just a gray shaded model with poly paint is really super effective. And when I retopologize these pieces, so let's go into the pants. I actually, whoa, that sounds weird. If I go UV map and say morph UV, we can kind of see the UVs are laid out, right? So something I can do, let's go ahead and divide this guy a bit. He's got a little texture already applied to him, and I want to talk about some of the ways to get a decent finishing texture like this. So I'll actually undo back down to his lowest level, and then I'm just going to say delete higher. Or actually, I'll duplicate them, and then say, turn on solo, and then go to geometry, say delete higher. And now I'll just subdivide them a bit. And I'm keeping an eye down here in the lower left for me. So I'm getting up to, 2.4 million polys. And I want to get a really nice, simple texture on here for, again, quick concept things like this. Something I'm a big fan of is the surface noise. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to Lightbox noisemakers, and I use stuff like this all the time. You can make your own alphas for this, and in my original I have it as a separate alpha, but this is a good example. So I'm just going to double click that and then hide Lightbox, and then I'm going to go over to Edit and zoom in and just kind of move, and you can see you get this weird stretchy texture, but because he has good UVs laid out, if I click on the UV button instead of 3D, so now it's trying to do a 3D projection on this thing that's really twisted in space. If I click UV, it's actually going to give me something that lays out to the UVs, and if I click scale, I can go ahead and scale it down. I can change the color blending so I don't really get any color, so if I set that to 0, I won't get any color, and I can adjust the strength, right? Now you need to have enough polygons to or enough subdivisions to take advantage of this. And something you hear a lot is people who say things like, well, how many subdivision levels is a good number, right? I don't know what you have in the bank. So if you tell me today you have 6 times the amount that you had in the bank yesterday, I'll go, I don't know if that's good or bad. So it really just matters what you start with, right? The thing that you start with will determine how many subdivision levels you have. If you start with something with 1 million polygons, you're not going to get a lot. Start with something that has, 100 polygons, you're going to get a lot, right? So if I take this guy, say, OK, we can see the surface noise on the mesh, but it's still not applied, right? So this is another thing where you got to play around a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and say, apply to mesh. Let's just see. All right, thinking. All right, pretty good, right? But, I forgot to sculpt in my detail first. So one of the other things I love about ZBrush, as opposed to other, sculpting programs that shall not be named, but one of the things I love about this is the way the brush system works. So if you hover over a brush, you see it says base type clay, base type inflate, base type clay, right? So there's a whole series of brushes. So let's go here, and I'm just going to look for the form soft brush, right? And Form Soft is a brush that will let you sculpt on top of this detail without adjusting the detail. So for example, really quickly, I got this assignment to work on something, right before lunch, and it needs to be done at 2:30. I can play with, let me turn off RGB. I can play with, adjusting and adding a seam. Okay, cool. But now I want that seam to really feel like it's a seam. If I go into Form Soft, I can not only put in big wrinkles without really disturbing my texture. Let's turn up the intensity a little bit. There we go. So I can put in big wrinkles without disturbing the texture, but I can also use that at a smaller resolution to start to make this a believable stitch, right? A believable bit of fabric that's kind of pushed together. And now without too much work, I'm able to get something that will start to read, hopefully, as fabric, right? And just little things like this, it really allows you to focus on the right stuff, So I can really go in and kind of say, to someone sitting in my proximity, hey, could you get in this pose real quick? And I could kind of look at the wrinkle patterns on their pants and just say, okay, well, I think it would be more or less like this. And now I can kind of start something, as opposed to just awfully winging it like I'm doing right now.
Can we take a question from Twitter real quick?
For sure.
All right, Nick Zuccarello, sorry. In the film pipeline, do you use modeling templates to start? Are films starting to use 3D maquettes more now? And big respect.
I love Nick Zuccarello.
He's a great artist.
Yeah, for sure. And if you guys haven't been to his website, definitely look him up. He's got tons of great resources. The guy is so generous. He's a tremendous person and artist. And it depends, again, on what you're doing. If you're talking about making the final model, so the way I use ZBrush on the film I just got off of a few months ago, I ran the gamut. So sometimes I was getting, a design consultation from a really incredible character designer, a gentleman named Devin Crane, and he was super busy. And he'd come by, drop off a napkin sketch sometimes, and say, try to execute this. In that case, I wouldn't really worry about a base mesh unless it was related to another character. So I'm making an alternate version of character A. Then yeah, I'd leverage off of something that exists. But usually I would just kind of block out whatever I wanted and just get shape approval from them and then worry about the technical stuff later. Other times I was using it in a way where we were making alternates or making several generic versions of a particular kind of human. In that case, definitely I was using a base mesh a lot. But in both cases, I use ZBrush all the time. Again, I could get it done in other tools, but nothing allowed me to do it as fast as this. And it sounds like crazy, right? It's like, oh God, here comes ShamWow, right? Like I'm just up here saying something. I have zero loyalty to ZBrush, and I've said this before. If a new tool comes out tomorrow that allows me to do stuff better than this, I will jump to that tool, right? As an artist, I owe it to myself to do that. I've been using ZBrush for almost, 9, 10 years, something like that, and I've never really had to do that. In fact, ZBrush, if this is the amount of work that I get done in a day, ZBrush used to take up this much, and it's just been pushing other tools out of the way for a really long time, and I hope it continues, and all the stuff that they're showing, so my loyalty is conditional to it being the best program, right? And so far, so good,
We got a question here live on the floor, Danny.
No, I don't deal with live questions. No, what's up?
Okay, sorry.
When you're reposing, do you use a second level for the pose and then the first level for T-pose, or?
Oh, that's the one thing I didn't show with that. Yeah, it'll actually give you a layer when you use Transpose Master. We're running out. I don't want to go all the way back, but try it. When you turn on in Transpose Master the Z-Sphere rig, right next to it, there's a thing for give me a layer. right? And if you turn that on, it will actually give you a separate layer so you can pop the whole thing at each subtool, right? So you can have 50 subtools. It'll pop each one back to its default. And I hope that answers. There's one other thing. Hey, Naked. Okay. All right, so 10 minutes, so I'll actually jump back to the other Z tool. Sorry, so this will take a second to open.
We might as well take this question here while you're opening the files.
Go for it.
Hey, Danny, big ups, man.
Thank
Is there an advantage to using a Z-Sphere rig to pose as to, say, Transpose Master, or?
If you're gonna pose it more than once, if you're gonna pose it in more than one pose. So, Transpose Master is really good. It's like, if I was doing a pose like this, and then another pose like this, maybe I would just Transpose Master it. But if I'm doing a pose like this, and one like this, and one like this, that's where Z-Sphere rigs really come in handy, because you can quickly get, believable joint movement and rotation, using the same parameters really quickly. So that's where Z-Sphere rigs are really, really super. And I didn't use them for a long time. True story. I saw Paul did a video on them a long time ago, and I was like, I'm not using that. And then one of my buddies at work, Robert Vignon, he showed me a demo of it, and I was like, I'm totally using that, because I was like standing over his shoulder, and I could ask him questions directly, like, but what if you want to do this? And he was just like, boom, 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 so it was really, really great. The last thing I want to talk to you guys about, hopefully you don't mind a little nudity, is you can use layers with paint too. One of the knocks that I hear a lot of times with ZBrush is, oh, well, it needs a better layering system, for how it paints, right? For, again, this kind of quick VizDev work, I really like to use this. So if I go down to layers, it's one of the ways that I use layers the most. I'm going to make sure RGB and Z-Add are turned on, and I'm going to click that. And this was the way that I added the face paint, even though I kind of closed it down. So let's say we wanted to add something here, right? I'm going to go to my standard brush. I'm going to turn on RGB and, paint some pattern on here, right? So he's got some crazy thing on there. And then let's go back, kind of cut into it a little bit at the edges. Oops. So C to pick up the last color. And this is kind of the way that I did his face paint. And then just kind of cut out a big swatch. Like so. And that exists on that layer, right? And I'm not painting any it's just one of the things that you hear people say a lot, and it's like, whoa, well, if you actually try it, it works. So it's a pretty cool feature, I think, that is underutilized. So for me, I just love that I can go ahead and get an idea out really quickly. The fact is, with the production level poly sculpting tools that these guys are coming out with, they're now closing the gap, I think, between, it was always ZBrush and another tool. And now I see myself in a few versions just using only ZBrush. There's a couple of little things that I think if they add those in future iterations, and I'm sure they will, it will be just my primary tool, and I haven't had that in a very long time. I jump around into a ton of tools, and again, if one of the features they don't do as well as I like, I jump to something else. But I always come home to ZBrush. So
There's another question here from the floor in the middle.
Yep.
Obviously, posing is important because you have to give the client multiple poses to choose from. The only issue is like the crunching on certain folded areas, besides going in there and smoothing. Like obviously his arm being brought in,
Right.
you're gonna get a lot of crunchy goodness.
Right.
And they're very picky about that.
Right.
I'm wondering if there's any kind of little trick that you might have
Yep.
to help us out.
So I'm going to give a shout out to another group of friends of mine, Mold 3D. If you know their website or know their stuff, definitely check out their stuff. They have all kinds of tips and tricks for this kind of stuff. What I would imagine they would probably say, they're way more well-versed in this than I What I would imagine they would probably say is to create a key system right before and after the break. You know, that's the only way to really deal with it. And then you have to treat it like it's a pos neg, right? It's like a positive negative. So if the arm is bent up like that, don't swoon, ladies. If the arm is bent up like that, then what you're gonna end up with is almost like a piece here where the bicep goes over and the negative of the bicep is cut out of the forearm, right? So you end up with a total.
Any other questions from here? Here's a question. You know, hey, it's just a quick one. What type of music do you listen to when you're sculpting?
I grew up in the South Bronx in the 80s, so I normally listen to hip hop.
NWA or something? What?
I'm sorry?
What, NWA or something?
No, mostly Enya. No. Just a wide range. And I'm getting to a certain age where I'm just becoming a cranky old man about stuff like that. Where I'm like, it's not like it was in '92, right? So that's basically, but I'm all over the place. Some days I'll just listen to a bunch of new agey stuff. Some days I'll listen to classical. Some days I'll listen, I have a rock day, so it just all depends. And then I'll end with this. So this is, Maya has a viewport 2.0 shader, which is like almost like a game viewing kind of shader. And this is where we ended up with the character from class with just kind of a 3-point light system, and the effects are all just super simple. And for me personally, this technology is going to drive how I work on my reels in the future. No more like sitting there sweating over a renderer like, oh God, I didn't realize the foot wasn't touching the ground. Like now I can not have to wait 20 hours to see that. I can see it pretty much real time. But ZBrush is a huge part of that. All the textural elements, all the layout and base and everything for this character. 90% of the character is here, and I'm just showing it someplace else. So to me, it's no different than like the keyshot bridge or something like that. It's just a way to see what you've done afterwards, right? So, and if you guys like what you see, take a class at UArtsy, so, but yeah, ZBrush is great. I love it.
Yeah, I got one last question from Magdalena Dadella.
Oh.
Hey, Magda. So at work, when creating a character model, do you create a range of expressions for approval, like squash, stretch, neutral?
Yeah, it depends on the job. So like, it's weird. At Dreamworks, every show is run a little bit different, right? So it just depends on who I'm working with. On the show that I was on, working with Devin, I did that quite a bit. You know what I mean? So it's like you want to see 10 different hairstyles on a character, or 10 different facial expressions on a character, or how two characters relate to one another, both posed around each other. Those are all areas where I would use ZBrush quite a bit. So.
All right, Danny Williams, everyone.
Thanks, guys.